Hey there, art nerds. Welcome to my third and final Papercraft for 2021. We have created 3 Papercrafts together, 2 standees, including, or not including this one, and 1 ornament. So if you're interested in making some beautiful holiday decorations yourself at home, I'll link the other 2 tutorials down in the description below. So this is going to be a full start to finish tutorial where I show you how to sketch, ink, paint, and assemble this Papercraft design. If you're one of my awesome art nerds over on Patreon, I've already shared the line art and the printable watercolor illustration with you guys. So if you want to play along at home, check Patreon because those are waiting for you. And if you're not a Patreon yet, there's still time. You can join today and get the line art and the printable. So as with my other Papercraft tutorials, I'm starting with just a thumbnail, a rough idea. So while I was at Joann's, I saw all this wintry foliage on sale for like 50% off. It's going to be even cheaper after Christmas if you feel like waiting, if you're looking for that much of a deal. And since I was already doing an ice princess design, which I've already created and shared, and hopefully you guys will check it out, I thought I might pick up some foliage and use that to help decorate her. I ended up going in a very different direction in terms of decoration. So I decided to create something even more wintry feeling. So I'm creating a standee today, which means we're going to be using a triangular base, and she should be able to stand so you can display her almost wherever you'd like to. And in the sketch, I'm really reliant on this large cape for a lot of kind of the storytelling. This is also a standee designed to hold something, so the arm was drawn separately. I am going to have a base on this, and I liked the idea of using snow as part of the base, as we saw with the first Papercraft tutorial I shared, Kara and Tanner having a snowball fight. So that's an idea that I'm going to be reusing for this. Now, this is a 2.5D figure, which means we start with a pretty flat design. You can actually add additional elements to make this more 3D or more 2.5D, but I like to keep these fairly simple so that way you guys can recreate them at home. And the only really 2.5D element on this is going to be the arm that's going to help hold the foliage in addition to the foliage itself. So I went through a few different iterations with this. Originally, I was thinking of something kind of elegant, so like a Snow Queen kind of design where Kara's wearing this longer dress, but that doesn't really fit her personality in the comic. So I decided to go with something way more serviceable and way more like what Kara herself would wear. So she's got a pair of trousers. Now, when designing her outfit, I'm working pretty heavily from reference, but I'm not working from any single reference. I'm actually working from several different images for inspiration. So she's got this kind of wraparound sweater. When I looked that up, a lot of references to like Outlander came up, so I guess it is a Scottish design. I should know that. I do have Scottish in me, but I don't. Growing up in Southeast Louisiana, a lot of your heritage gets kind of stripped away from you if you're not one of the 3 more dominant nationalities down here. So I just wasn't educated in that background, unfortunately. So for this illustration, or for this paper child illustration, I wanted to have some additional decorations. And since I do enjoy, or I used to enjoy sewing and embroidery, that's an element that I bring into my work pretty frequently. So I placed the foliage just to make sure it kind of worked with it thematically before I started inking in case I needed to make any sort of changes to the design. I'm also using it to figure out where I'm going to place it to make sure that the arm positions themselves work. Now I'm inking today again, as almost always, with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. Now, I'm a big fan of brush pens because basically, if you like to ink, or if you do ink things and you're using microns or multi-liners, you know that you need several pens to kind of build up your line weight. You need one pen for super duper fine lines, and while you could use that same pen over and over and over and over and over again, thus wrecking your hands and your wrists because you only have so many miles on your drawing hand. But you could use that super teeny one and totally wreck the nib and your hand, or you could use a much larger nib, and in the end you end up with 8 different nibs. However, with brush pens, you just need one pen, maybe 3 pins for the majority of the line weights that you're going to want to create. So I love brush pins. They do take some getting used to, especially if you're very used to fine liners or felt tip pins and you're used to really bearing down when you're creating line weights. With brush pins, the lighter your hand is, the lighter you draw that line, the less pressure you apply, the finer a line you're going to get, and the heavier you push down, the more you push down on your brush pin, the heavier a line you're going to get. And this is really useful in creating line weight, which, as I talked about in the first Papercraft tutorial that I shared in this series of 3, creating line weight can be really helpful in a variety of ways. It can tell you how heavy that object is, how close that object is to the viewer, how close that object is to the light source, all sorts of, it can even be used to denote importance. You can, if you have a really cartoony style, you can give something that's really important a much heavier line weight, and that'll really help attract the viewer's attention and tell them, hey, this is something that you need to pay attention to. So brush pins make doing all of those things a whole lot easier, and I'd love to see them more popular with just a variety of artists and illustrators. They're already very popular with brush and, hand calligraphers, and I see most of the marketing for these aimed at them. And while that's cool, I'd love to see some comic artist and illustrator rep in the world. So, hey, let the companies know that you're using these brush pins for your art and illustration, and maybe they'll actually start marketing to us. So once I finished inking my line art, I allow it to cure for 24 hours. That allows the pigment particles to really adhere to the paper, and then I use a white vinyl eraser to erase it. I then scanned the line art and shared it on Patreon. So next up, it's time to watercolor, and I'm using some low-tack blue 3M painter's tape. I've been using this kind of painter's tape for years with my watercolor illustrations and my watercolor comic pages, and I really find that this works the best. I've tried a few different things, including masking tape and painter's tape, i.e. watercolor painter's tape, which is not actually meant to be removed from the paper. That was a horrible surprise for me. And the 3M Blue painter's tape really works the best. So for this illustration, for this paper craft, there is a lot of snow, and I already kind of talked about snow and wet and to wet in the first tutorial. I'm borrowing a lot of techniques, or I'm just reutilizing a lot of techniques from the first 2 tutorials. So if you haven't watched them yet, you ought to check them out. I think they're pretty cool. I think the idea is really neat. I love making paper crafts. I love designing paper crafts. I love imagining my characters in the real world, and these sort of small paper crafts work so well for that because Kara herself is just 7 inches tall, and a standard sheet of inexpensive Canson XL watercolor paper, like I'm using today, is 9 by 12. So the scale is perfect. I can easily draw Kara at her real life scale of 7 inches and place her in my real world. And it's just so fun to be able to bring your characters to life in yet another way, to be able to pose them and display them in the world. And you can totally take inspiration from this and draw your own character in this. And if you do that, or if you decide to color and paint and cut along with me today, I would love to see it. So please tag me at NattoSoup so I can lavish you with compliments and admire your original characters. So as with most of my paper craft tutorials, I am painting with the Core Mini palette. I have sung the Core Mini palette's praises numerous times. I have no affiliation with Core as a company. I think I met the owner one time at a Hands-On Creativity, and she seems like a lovely person, but I don't think she remembers me at all. So I think it's pretty safe to say we don't really have any affiliation whatsoever, but I'm a big fan of these professional grade watercolors. So first of all, the Core Mini palette. I have had this Core Mini palette for like 4 years now. I use it pretty dang frequently. You guys see it pop up in a lot of my videos, and I bring it with me when I travel because it's basically the size of a credit card. A little goes a really long way with these watercolors. These are super saturated watercolors, so you can really stretch them out. And I still haven't refilled this palette yet, although it's getting to be time to do so. These colors are also super mixable, and that's one of the reasons they work so well for these sort of papercraft activities, is even though I only have 12 colors, no space is wasted on a white. No space is wasted on a black. We have a Payne's gray, which works really well as a neutral tint, which can be used to darken some of the colors in this palette. The colors themselves mix really well together, and they just make a lot of sense as a cohesive palette. So if you're looking for a good professional grade watercolor palette that's going to last you a really long time, is very easy to use, delivers a lot of beautiful, bright color, and isn't going to disappoint. This is the palette to go for. It's around $68, which I know some people feel is really expensive, but y'all, I'm halfway through the student grade showdown where I'm reviewing much cheaper paints. And I have to say, being able to paint with nicer, more expensive paints again, I can really vouch that this palette is a great deal for your money, and you're gonna really enjoy it time after time. So I'm not gonna go too deep in all the individual steps for this tutorial, since I've already done that twice over, and I really want you guys to watch those tutorials too. So I'll just link them for you guys, and hopefully you'll do those as well. But the main techniques that I use when I'm doing watercolor illustration is I layer, where I just layer either the same color on top of itself once it's had a chance to dry. So that would be wet over dry, in order to build up saturation, contrast, form, and volume, and add some shading. Or I layer a different color on top of that. Now with her cheeks, I did use some clean water to kind of blend that out. The main, most important thing I want to point out that's different about this particular tutorial is what I'm doing with her cape. So in the mini palette, there isn't necessarily a good dark green. Now I could mix a darker green using sap green and phthalo blue, or phthalo blue and that super light cadmium yellow or bismuth yellow over at the top. But I do that a lot, and I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I wanted a color that frankly felt more wintry and Christmassy. So this time I mixed some ultramarine blue with the sap green, and I ended up getting this really beautiful green color that granulates a lot. So that there's actually a lot of visual interest and visual texture to her cape, which I really appreciate. So in this set, there also isn't what we would think of as like a good, strong, true red. So to achieve a red, I am mixing, I found out it's not alizarin crimson. I've been lying to you guys. It sure looks like alizarin crimson, but it's actually pyrrole red with the magenta that's right next to it. And that gives us kind of a good mid red. If you want that red to be a warmer mid red, you can mix the pyrrole orange that's right next to it that actually looks like an orange. And that'll kind of brighten it up and make it feel a little warmer and more fiery. If you want to cool it down, you can go with more magenta, or even start mixing in some of the dioxine purple that's in this set. However, I find that the dioxine purple is very saturated and has a tendency to take over the color blends and color mixes. So if you guys are familiar with 7-inch Kara or my work on Lilliputian Living, my yearly Tiny People zine, you know that I'm very interested in the natural world and natural dyes, and I use a lot of natural color coding when it comes to Kara. So colors that can be derived from plants or from animals or from insects, that's typically what Lilliputians might use. And while they do scavenge fabrics from humans, by the time they get a hold of those fabrics, they're usually pretty faded and worn out and might have to be re-dyed or repurposed anyway. So generally, I keep her color palette very light greens and blues, and if I'm using reds, they're more muted reds and a lot of grays and a lot of browns. Not because Kara herself doesn't appreciate bright colors. If you read the comic, she does. It's that those are just not as accessible to Lilliputians, and the only way she can really get a hold of those sort of colors or things with those kind of colors is during her relationship with Naomi, the human girl that she befriends. And if you guys haven't read 7-inch Kara yet, I really hope you will. You can read it for free as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com, or you can purchase volume 1 and volume 2 in the Natto shop. I'm currently running a bundle deal where you can get both of them together for a much lower price. It makes a really really great Christmas gift if you have somebody in your life who's a fan of animation or likes anime or Studio Ghibli, or a younger reader who likes comics, or someone who enjoys watercolor picture books. Those are all sort of the design and aesthetic sensibilities that I brought into 7-inch Kara. So I really hope you guys will check it out. And if you do, let me know what you think. So I couldn't get her cape quite as dark as I wanted with just mixing sap green and ultramarine blue, so I introduced a little bit of the Payne's gray to really help darken it up. And that's kind of what I mean by you can use the Payne's gray in this palette as sort of a neutral tint to add in that depth and that shadow that you might not otherwise be able to just mix from the colors themselves, since this is a limited color palette. So you guys can see when I'm watercoloring, I typically like to start with the larger objects or the areas that are going to use up more color first, and then work my way to the details as I go. And this kind of helps prevent bleeding and color pollution and color reactivation. And it just makes sense. Even with watercolor, you're going to want to work fat over lean. And what I mean by that is we're talking about the saturation of the color itself. So we're going to work with really lean, thin washes of color first, and then we're going to add our more saturated, fatter mixes of color on top of that. And that's going to really help prevent our illustration from turning into a muddy mess. So towards the end of the illustration, I start using white gouache, which is an opaque watercolor, to add in some highlights, to refine some of the details, to add the shine to her eyes, and to splatter some snow in front of her to really kind of sell that snowy impression. Because if you guys remember my foliage, a lot of that has like that fake snow on it. So I really wanted it to carry through thematically. And once I finish my watercolor painting, it's time to remove it from the gator board stretcher board that I used as a support. And I remove my blue painter's tape, peeling away at a 90-degree angle away from the watercolor illustration. I allow it to dry fully, I scan it, and then I share the printable with my patrons on Patreon. So for the assembly portion of this papercraft, you're going to need a lot of things. And I really recommend you get a good glue for this one. Tacky glue isn't going to cut it. I'm using E600 today. If you are a younger artist or you're sensitive to fumes, I would highly recommend that unfortunately you either skip this one, modify it to her holding something designed out of paper, or you ask somebody else to help you. I'm also going to be using some wider ribbon that I purchased at Michael's, some Jingle bells, some popsicle sticks, a boatload of tape, some white washi or masking tape if you happen to have that, some tacky glue, it does come in handy later on, some single-sided tape, and you're going to need about $4 in quarters or a bunch of small weights. And one of the first things I do before I even start cutting out anything is I start working with the bouquet that she's going to be holding, because it's going to require a lot of gluing and wait time. And I want to kind of separate one of these little bundles out so that I can repurpose it, rearrange it, and kind of redesign it to work with what I've got. So I've got some holly leaves that are totally covered in glitter. I've also got some berries and leaves that have been frosted, and I've got my original bouquet that I kind of disassembled. And I'm using that white washi tape or that white masking tape. You can also use floral tape in this. I'm using it to kind of start holding the bundle together as I'm arranging it so that I don't have to like consistently rearrange it or readjust it. And I leave this on for the whole thing, but you end up not seeing it at all, which is pretty handy. And I snip the stems using a wire cutter. This isn't a particularly good wire cutter, but I would recommend you raid the toolbox and find a wire cutter. And I'm going to use the washi tape and I'm going to wrap it all the way down the stem to hold everything in place. Now, if you use a floral tape or if you use a decorative washi tape, you wouldn't necessarily have to use the ribbons if you don't want to, but I'm going to use both ribbon and washi tape. And this is where one of the areas where the E600 is really important, because this is a glue that's got a really strong hold. So I use a little bit of the E600 to tape it in place, or to secure it in place, and then I tape it down just to hold it while it dries, because I want it to really bond with it. I don't want it coming loose. And then I wrap it, gluing it each time I wrap it around the stem. And I'm going to wrap it like this all the way down the stem. And since I don't want the ribbon coming loose at any point, I'm gluing it every time it reaches the front. And while I'm working with the larger part of the stem, I'm just gluing it each time because I didn't want it getting all over my hands. But as we reach the bottom of the stem, I am going to run a line of E600 all the way down. Now you could use hot glue for this, like a hot glue gun for this. I would have burnt myself 6 times over using a hot glue gun for this. But if you're really sensitive to fumes, and E600 has a lot of fumes, I was kind of giving myself a headache, even though I was working in a well-ventilated area. You do want to be really careful with it. And I'm using some of the white washi tape just to tape it down while it dries, and I'm cutting it off at an angle so it'll be less prone to fraying. And this needs to cure for at least an hour before you can really proceed with this. So this is one of the more time-consuming ones. I'm going to use a little bit of the tacky glue just to kind of tack it in place. And part of the reason for that is tacky glue sets up much quicker than E600 does, although I don't know if it ever fully cures. It seems to have worked really well with the other Papercraft activities though. And while that's all drying and curing, I can spend my time focusing on cutting this out. So as with the other Papercrafts, you're going to want to save all your large scraps because those are going to be really useful in building a sturdy base for this one. And then I went and bought a new X-Acto blade, and it is so much better and so much more comfortable. So I'm going to use this X-Acto blade to do all the fussy cutting. But if you have a Cricut or other type of cutting machine, it could be a great way to either make a bunch of these or to cut it out really quickly. Some folks could use an X-Acto blade to cut out the whole thing and have zero issues whatsoever, but this is a really heavy well, it's not a really heavy watercolor paper, but it is a heavier watercolor paper. So I switched over to scissors for more of my cutting, and I'm going to keep checking to make sure the arm placement works. So I saved my scraps from the other 2 Papercrafts, and I'm gonna probably be utilizing paper from those as well. So generally when I'm doing these kind of Papercrafts, I hoard all my watercolor scraps in case I need them a little bit later on. So I'm checking the placement of the arm and the bundle just to make sure that it works. And a little bit later on, I'm going to use this foam tape that I got at Dollar Tree to make sure that her arm, the one that we cut out, is extended enough to actually go around the bundle. So I thought it would be cute to tie a ribbon around the bundle and just kind of like, tie it all together. I did glue it in the back with tacky glue. And at first I tried to put my bells on it, and then I realized that I'm just making life harder by trying to work around the bells. So after I glued it in place, I tied a bell on each side, tied a knot, and I'm letting that dry for a while before I attempt to tie it into a bow. And there we have our bow. It's looking pretty cute. If you have an already made bow that you'd like to use, you can just glue that to the front, or flowers, or whatever makes you happy, whatever makes your heart sing. So this thing is going to be really honking heavy. So we're going to need a lot of structural stability. So I'm utilizing my popsicle sticks, cutting some of them down to size to give this Kara a lot of structure and stability. Now, if you've got a good quick dry glue, I would really recommend you use your quick dry glue here, but I'm using double stick tape for this because that's what I've been doing for, all of these paper crafts. And, I just basically eat tape. I just love double stick tape. I really do. Hey, Scotch, you should totally call me. I'm also using the less expensive single-sided tape to just kind of secure it down on the back. Now, you can use a matte tape for that. It would look better, but this is Dollar Tree tape that I'm working with. I'm also using the same triangle base technique that I've used in a lot of my standee paper crafts, where we take two pieces of watercolor paper cut to the same size, and we basically turn them into a triangular base with the side that has the overlap, providing a lot of structural stability. That's the side that's going to go against the paper child's back. I'm also cutting a triangular base out of the same watercolor paper. What I would actually recommend you do is that you create some flanges so that it tapes up into the side. But what I'm doing is I'm using the single-sided tape to kind of tape it across the bottom, and then I'm taping it across the sides and folding it down so that it's touching both sides. And I'm going to do that on the inside as well because I'm just like addicted to tape and I basically eat tape. So I'm using about $1 worth of quarters here and wrapping it with tape going both ways to act as a counterweight. You can use whatever coins you've got handy. You don't have to use coins at all. You could use whatever small weights work for you. So now that I've got most of that handled and figured out, I'm going to apply a line of E600 to our little our little flower bundle. I'm going to weight it down because I'm not going to sit here and hold it down for an hour, and then I'm going to let it cure. So E600 has about it takes 24 hours to fully cure, but it needs an hour to kind of set up, and it'll still be pretty movable. And mine was kind of movable at this point. So I added another line of E600 just to make sure it doesn't rip off the paper. So after I did that and let that dry, I'm going to use a popsicle stick to provide even more support. Now, what I would actually recommend is a straw, like a paper straw would actually be really good for this, or a pipe cleaner, or a piece of not so bendable wire. The popsicle sticks are fine. It's just that they're kind of visible. And I'm using the E600 and I'm going to mash some of that foliage into the popsicle stick just to make sure that it has some support. This is a very over-engineered papercraft. You might want to work with a lighter bundle. I actually really like how mine turned out, but I know not everybody is going to want to spend several hours and a boatload of tape and a bunch of E600 gluing foliage to a paper figurine. So feel free to sub it out with whatever works for you. And I allowed that to dry for an hour underneath some weights. And once it kind of cured, I can start working on her arm. And I'm using the foam tape, building it up 3 layers. So this thing is adhesive on both sides. So what I recommend you do is remove that protective paper. Otherwise, it's not going to stick so well. And I found that it took about a sandwich of 3, maybe 4 to get it high enough. And I also put some I put some E600 on the back of her hand so that it really doesn't go anywhere, because last year's candy cane thief, after a couple of years, she started to drop her candy cane. She's actually holding a pencil now, but I wanted to make sure that this Kara did not drop her burden. All right, so everything's fairly dry. I'm checking to make sure it's sturdy. I'm kind of shaking it around to make sure nothing like drops off or nothing breaks or nothing kind of peels off. And I also noticed that it's really heavy on the side that she's holding foliage. So I'm using about $1 worth of coins to create a counterweight. And you guys will see that in the base, I also added 2 additional bundles of coins, about $1 each. You can definitely use like little rocks, any kind of small, unobtrusive weight would work for this. Just make sure it's heavy enough. Now, I would recommend you glue it down, but I'd already been recording for several hours, so I just did not want to wait for glue to dry. So I used my handy dandy double stick tape, and I'm also creating some additional support using a popsicle stick. So it's a good thing I got this pack of popsicle sticks at Dollar Tree, because I could see you running through a bunch of popsicle sticks really fast, especially if you decide that you enjoy making paper children. Now, traditionally you would use just paper and tape and paper and glue for this sort of project, but I find that the popsicle sticks make it a lot easier and they make them a lot more sturdy than what a paper craft would normally be. So that's why I like to use popsicle sticks for these kind of projects. And she's looking pretty dang cute, if I do say so myself. Those colors work really well. So since I live in Southeast Louisiana and we don't have snow, I went to the store and bought some snow. So we have a nice snowy background to kind of pose her against. But gee, she sure would look cute if you live in an area of snow and you could pose her in front of a window. That would just be absolutely adorable. And she's basically done. We could say she's done. Here she is with many of the materials that I used to create this paper craft. Although you guys know I used a few more and I'll have them all listed in the description below for you guys. But I just could not leave well enough alone. I had to tape her even more. I had to tape on the sides. Not necessarily because she needed it, but because I guess I'm just a little bit paranoid and I might quite possibly have a tape addiction. So I added another piece of the foam tape up at the top just to make sure that the popsicle sticks are really actually adhering to each other and are able to provide support. And then I did a bunch more of the single-sided tape going down the back just to make sure like things don't fall off too quickly. I live in a really humid area, so humidity can be a problem for these things, and that's one of the reasons I tend to really over-engineer them. All right, so that mostly does it. That is the third and final Papercraft project that I have for you guys in 2021. Although I have some plans for some coming up in March that I'm really looking forward to as well. I hope you guys have a happy and safe and wonderful holidays. Tutorials like this one are seriously, legitimately only made possible thanks to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for your support and encouragement over the years. It really means the world to me. Okay, so I just finished with my last paper craft of the year, and she turned out pretty cute. Look how ridiculously over-engineered she is. So when I was in kindergarten, my kindergarten class had a writing center, which was just a bunch of like stationery supplies and papers and tapes and stuff. And I got banned. Miss Rogers banned me from the writing center, not once, but twice, for these kinds of shenanigans. She said that was more suited to the Arts and Crafts Center, but she didn't have any tape in the Arts and Crafts Center. So this is why I buy Dollar Tree tape, because I just plow through tape and stationery supplies over, and I'm about to start taping it on the sides too because she's really heavy. And I did glue this on using E600, like serious glue, and then waited a couple of hours for it to set. But I don't know, I don't want her to fall apart. I don't want her to just like flop over and die. So I'm about to get back to taping, but I wanted to show how ridiculous this is to somebody. Do I expect other people to do this? I mean, if you want to. I ended up using like all the foliage that I bought when I had originally intended to only use like some of it because I don't know how to curate. Anyway, Joseph's holding the camera. I was hoping he'd ask me some questions, but he's like, I'm playing Texorcist. I want to get back to playing Texorcist.
I mean, you didn't tell me anything. It looks good.
Well, thank
I don't have any questions,
I thought you would laugh at how much. I mean, it's like covered in tape on the back. I thought you would at least be like, why not? Why didn't you use glue? Because I hate glue and I'm impatient, and tape is my best friend. That's why I didn't use glue. Anyway, thank you for filming. You can get back to Texorcist now.